You're watching a recording of the Joint Public Issues Team National Conference 2020. In this session, we're digging deeper into economics with Katherine Trebeck.
My name is John Ellis. If you want to know why, as an economist, I've been allowed to come today, you can read your little CV in the newsletter. The more important person here is Katherine. My role is essentially to be the neutral facilitator, but I hope Katherine will forgive me if for a moment I become very biased indeed and commend her book to you. Her book is called The Economics of Arrival. And if you've no idea what that title conveys, I'm afraid I didn't either till I got into the book. But the analogy she invites us to think about is of economics being a bit like an aircraft flight, perhaps around that globe over there. And in an aircraft flight, you have different stages. You control it in one way when you're trying to get to liftoff, then a different way as you ascend to 30,000 feet or whatever, and then you control it in a slightly different way as you fly to wherever you're going to, and then eventually you arrive. You then forget about the aircraft and the aircraft controls, and you live doing whatever you wanted to do where you've arrived. And essentially the argument of the book is that for the last 200 years, what we've asked the economy to do is be that way of getting to a destination. The purpose we asked it to deliver for us was to go on growing the economy. The argument in the book is the economy has now, in a sense, arrived, at least for some of us in countries like this. So how do we change the instructions to the economy, the tasks we want the economy to do, when simply going on growing with no sense of ever arriving makes no sense? And when we've arrived, we want a different task for the economy. So the issue is not how do we go on growing, that was the journey. Now we've arrived, how do we improve the economy rather than simply grow it? And the book does make the point that the idea of looking for improvement in the economy rather than just growing it, you can find in Adam Smith, seen often as the founder of classical economics in the 18th century. That may be a surprise to you if you've been fed that strange caricature of Adam Smith, that he was somehow a passionate supporter of free market economics as a solution to everything. He was nothing of the sort. But the idea of improving the economy rather than just growing the economy is fundamental to the book, and I think if you really press Katherine hard, she might sell you a copy of that later in the day.
They're at the back. There's a couple of copies for sale at the back.
Okay. Great.
Thank you.
So today we're not trying to deal with caricatures. The purpose of gathering together for a few hours is to hope we can get beyond the caricatures into some of the real issues. And I wonder, Katherine, if I might start, you've picked up this morning, as you do in the book, the idea that GDP has become a guiding measure of what we're asking the economy to deliver, and then a guiding measure as a result of what the politicians think we're asking them to do for us in the economic sphere. And you say, well, that's actually not a good measure. I suspect you get a majority vote for that in this hall without too much difficulty. But what is the single thing we put instead of GDP? Instead of the brief headline that says growth's gone up by 0.7% this quarter, what is that key concept that can make sense in a slot on breakfast time television or whatever to replace GDP as the task for the economy?
Can I just start by confessing I feel a bit sorry for GDP because it was never intended to become the measure of national success, and we've sort of inflated its purpose, and the original designer of GDP, Simon Kuznets, would be despairing at the sort of oversized role we've given it. So in a way, it's not GDP's fault. It wasn't designed to do what it's become purposed for, and in a way we should put it back in its place. But this idea of what we might replace it for is a really, really tricky one, and I think it's sort of the question of our time, and there's lots of arguments over that. Do we need a dashboard of indicators? Do we need one single composite measure? Where I've got to is that there is no shortage of alternatives out there. Someone's described the beyond GDP terrain as the Wild West of new measurement. There is almost, it seems every week, a new measure comes out. The World Bank have got their own, the World Economic Forum have got their own. There's a really great one worth looking at called the Social Progress Index, and that tallies up 52 different dimensions of social progress. And then it's a lovely map you can see. They map different countries according to GDP per capita. And that shows that in early stages of economic development, more growth really matters. You get very clear returns in terms of social progress, but then you enter a stage of diminishing marginal returns where you get less bang for your buck. So there's that. There's a genuine progress measure. There is hundreds of measures already out there. What I think they all fall down on is that they start as fairly well-intentioned initiatives, and then they quickly enter the terrain where the technocrats get their hands on them, and they become fairly complicated discussions around dashboards and indicators. And most people, when they talk about dashboards and indicators, they're talking about their cars, not measures of progress. And so I think we need to find a way to circle back so that we can have those public conversations about what is it that's most important in our lives. We need to find a way to have something that resonates with everyday people, not just geeky, sort of beyond GDP policy wonks like me. And where I keep coming back to is, imagine if we had a measure that correlated with the whole richness of what makes a connected, contented life, but also in and of itself resonated with the general community. So it ticked all the sort of statistical data slots. We knew it linked to all those drivers of collective well-being, but in and of itself it resonated with folks. And an example of that is the number of girls who ride their bikes to school. So imagine if that number is going up. What's in place there? The streets are safe. Girls have probably had their breakfast. Parents can afford bikes. There are local schools nearby. All sorts of different things. So imagine if we had half a dozen. So imagine next time Barry, who is sitting here, goes to the polls and says, under our administration, the number of girls who ride their bikes to school is going to go up. Then we've got a very, very different conversation about what the objective of politics is about. So that's a long way of saying I don't have an easy answer, but I think it has to be about connecting it back to everyday conversations and what really matters most to people, and just wrestle it out of the technocrats' hands, because in a way I think they've done their job. We're not short of data around this. The ONS, for example, it collects data about financial insecurity, and we count how many homeless people there are, and we know loneliness is going up. The problem is we don't count that and measure that and report on it as frequently as we report on GDP. There's not the media frenzy around things like rising numbers of homelessness as there is about the quarterly release of our GDP statistics. So it's now, I think, a conversation out of the statisticians' hands and into conversations and spaces like this to hold our politicians accountable for what matters much more to our lives.
Of course, one of the things Adam Smith did identify was that you're more likely to reach your objectives if people individually are pursuing things that matter to them, and that those things also deliver the wider objectives. Mm-hmm. One of the challenges here, it seems to me, is that you're asking quite a number of people to behave altruistically, to say there's a bigger story than just what feels most relevant to me at the moment. People in this room may say, well, we're all ready to change our lifestyles, but that's not the majority view in the electorate. Mm-hmm. And a number of our traditions would emphasize that human beings have a basic selfishness to be overcome. So how do you convert people to this altruism when you don't obviously have a way of saying it's good news for you now, today and tomorrow to believe in these bigger, wonderful principles?
So there's two things in that. One, I think people are more collaborative and caring and solidaristic than we give them credit for. I think the advertisers and those who want us to buy loads and loads more stuff would insist that we are just acquisitive and greedy and selfish. But actually, if you spend time with most people, you'll realize there is a bit of competition amongst us and we care about our own self-interest, but that's not the full picture. And there's a lot of evidence that shows we're actually most content, we're most flourishing when we're cooperating. The cortisol levels, the stress hormone, cortisol, goes down right in our veins if we're helping someone, or if we're cooperating, or if our relationships are good. And so there's more to us as human beings than the advertisers who are just wanting us to buy more stuff would hope there is. And I think the sort of policies that are conducive to shaping the economy are those that are much more aligned with our cooperative nature, our caring nature, our collegial nature. The other aspect of your question is how do we tell this story that it's a different economy is not just possible and necessary, but it's actually going to be pretty awesome. And I think that's partly what I was talking about earlier with these examples that already exist in practice, that there are heaps of examples of businesses that are starting to roll out different purpose. There are loads of community groups who are starting to embody this, and I think it's partly about pointing to and illuminating them. In my organisation, we call ourselves the amplifiers, so it's about amplifying those stories. But it's also about going back to those conversations about first principles. You know, what is it that really matters to people? And I was involved in a project many years ago when I was working with Oxfam called the Humankind Index, and we spent a lot of time talking to communities across Scotland about what really mattered to them, and we tallied that all together, all those bits of butcher's paper and sticky dots and post-it notes and opinion polls and online surveys, and we brought that all together. And people weren't saying they wanted footballer-type salaries or enormous houses with, you know, long driveways. What they told us is that they wanted, yes, enough money and decent jobs, but it was enough to participate and feel secure and know that their livelihoods were reliable. So they didn't want that insecurity of so many of the jobs on offer at the moment. But what really mattered most to them was their health, their relationships, and a good local environment. And we replicated those sorts of processes with colleagues in India and in Namibia. And there's been a film made out of the Namibian project. And I tell you what, our cousins in Namibia, when they're given the chance to sit down and talk about what really matters to them, they almost use identical words to people in Govan in Glasgow about what really matters. And it's about dignity and purpose. And so I think in a way the vision is shared. The challenge for me actually now is what's the political economy of that change? What's that transition story? How do we make sure people whose livelihoods depend on the current system, who have pretty good reason for holding on to the current system then, how do we make sure that they're not anxious about their ability to pay the bills, or they're not anxious about their ability of their kids to go to school? So that's up to political conversation and to societal conversation about making sure there are secure pathways so that there are no stranded communities, whereas we want some stranded assets in oil, yeah. So it's about really making sure that we as society look after those folk. So I think the vision is one that's, you know, if people given a chance to think about it, would share. But I think the more difficult conversation is sketching those pathways and making them feel realistic and doable. But there are examples to draw on, fortunately.
So if we move on a bit to those pathways, what are the levers? What can get us in this direction? And if I can read one of the questions that's been submitted, can ideas from the Old Testament, such as Jubilee, freeing people from debt, not charging interest, etc., can they be used to help transform our growth economy into a well-being economy?
Oh, great question. So there's a lot of research done on the role of debt, and particularly compound interest, and the extent to which it basically locks us into having to grow more, because we then have to pay the interest plus the compound, yeah? So there's a lot of research saying if we could have wide-scale forgiveness of debt, that will start to unpack that growth imperative. So I think that's part of the conversation. This is an area I'm certainly not expert in, so I'd urge you to look at the work of James Robertson or Positive Money or the work that the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity are doing. But I think debt forgiveness at a local level, at a national level, but also at a global level, as Anthony was saying. I mean, the debt systems that are structured in terms of between the global north and the global south are extraordinary in meaning that our cousins in countries around the world are paying more on their interest to big international institutions or big hedge funds than they are putting into their health and education systems. So debt is a huge piece of the jigsaw. It's not the only piece. There is no one silver bullet, but it's a huge conversation. And so this idea of Jubilee and resuscitating that from the sort of around the year 2000 when there was a big push from the church, I think we need to, put your shoulder into that, absolutely.
How about some questions from the floor in this area about what are the levers that might get us in the direction of the vision we've had? And there was a question on the very front here, please.
Sorry, my question was actually, you talked about all the examples that there are of different economies working. And my question is, where do you find these examples? I appreciate there's Cuba and there's Bhutan, but something a bit more nearer our Does your website give the examples?
So the examples are in microcosm. There is no economy that nails this yet. And there's work done by ecological economists at the University of Leeds who looked around the world to try and find a national economy that delivered on basic social provision for citizens at the same time as not putting undue pressure on the planet. So they looked around, essentially, if you know the idea of the donut by Kate Raworth, for a country that got inside the donut, delivered on social justice without putting undue pressure on the planet. And the bad news is no country can do it. So there's a big open corner on their graph where they've mapped all those different countries according to their provision on social justice and on pressure on the planet. Which is why I talk about needing to open up our imaginations to massive system change, because there is no one country that we can point to and say they've nailed it. There are good examples of the sorts of changes we need, but no one has yet put them together and changed them in the systemic way that's necessary. And that's why I keep coming back to the idea of how we purpose the economy, because unless we repurpose the economy and put things like collective well-being at the heart of it, or the number of girls who ride their bikes to school perhaps at the heart of it, then all those good examples that happen in microcosm will be going against the grain, and they'll be isolated and disconnected and just facing those headwinds. In the book, Jeremy, my co-author, who some of you might know, Jeremy Williams, he tallied it up and he said we've got about examples from across 30 different countries. And to me, what they do is they remind us that it is absolutely possible. And particularly it's businesses. I think we don't give business enough credit of people using business practices to deliver these sorts of provisions we need, whether it's community-owned energy, whether it's a cooperative, where it's making sure that the value share that's created by workers is owned by those workers and hence shared amongst those workers, whether it's social enterprises, whether it's companies embracing the circular economy like Renault or Philips or Schiphol Airport. There's the big shipping company Maersk, do you know that? They now make their ships with manuals for basically unpacking all the huge ship so that it can be reused and repaired and can create the next ship. So there's loads of stuff happening. It's loads of stuff happening at city level as well. In a way, I think who's missing from that conversation is so often nation states. And then we've got to have a conversation about our democracy. Why is it that the recalcitrant actor here is our nation states? But maybe that's for Barry.
That's for Barry. More on business in workshop 6 this afternoon.
Oh, great.
But a couple of questions have come in on the related area of investment and the purpose of investment, and several of the churches represented here are, of course, debating their own investment policies and where do we go with fossil fuel investment and so on, bearing in mind, on the one hand, that could be deplored. On the other hand, the largest investors in renewable energy research are the traditional oil companies. So what's your take on how investment policy might fit into the levers for change?
It's a tricky one because enabling, sort of shifting that wall of finance away from fossil fuels requires us to have obvious and ready places it can go. So there's not as if there's not work to do, there's just not enough mechanisms yet, I think, to easily funnel that money away from fossil fuels at the scale it's needed. But there are initiatives coming up. There are platforms emerging, for example, a regenerative investment platform from colleagues in the US, or the Systems Change Investment Fund from a guy called Frank Dixon. So there's examples bubbling up. I think one of the challenges is this idea of the demand that we have for, natural requirement of our pensions. So we all lean on our pensions to have some sense of security that our basic needs will be met in old age. And this is a question I haven't got the answer to, so maybe we'll be able to work on it together. But until we have perhaps an alternative way for making folks feel secure that their basic needs will be met when they retire, we're still going to be reliant on the stock market. And you think about it, the stock market is made up of publicly listed firms that are designed in a way to reward the owners of wealth as opposed to the workers who created that wealth, the environment in which that wealth depends, or let alone the communities that are part of creating that wealth. So these are firms that are designed in a way their success is increased share price. But we know that one of the huge drivers of economic inequality is returns to wealth. This is Thomas Piketty's stuff. So to me, there's a real is a real sort of puzzle here, is we've got these companies that are designed in a way that exacerbates inequality. So we've got to, and this is where, this is, to me, a sort of dream research project. How do we come back from that reliance on pension funds that are invested in the stock market, that rely on PLCs, without disrupting people's sense of security in old age? I don't have the answer for that yet, but I think it's something we need to turn our attention to. Because the design of firms essentially is not okay. It's not all right to increase, to have firms that are obsessed by quarterly profits, that are designed in a way where they're effectively incentivized to turn a blinkered eye to the impact on the environment and impact on workers. And there are so many folks in the investment communities that are up for this challenge. So in Edinburgh, there's a huge number of investment houses where people working in them are working with us to say, well, how do we grapple with these questions? But we haven't got answers yet. I don't know if from your experience in banks, John.
Well, certainly those of us who have been trustees of ministers' pension funds are extremely familiar with the issues and don't always find that legislation is the most helpful framework, even though the legislators assure us that they think this is very important. But that's going into pensions. Let's have a couple of other questions from the floor in this area of levers of change. Someone else? Question here. Yeah.
So there have been different words associated with economy, like circular economy, restorative economy, green economy. Do you think any of these can be these pathways to change, or any examples of how
I think they're all part of the picture, and the list could go on: the solidarity economy, the regenerative economy, the donut economy. They're all part of, I think, folks who are part of this growing movement, who are recognizing that business as usual can't carry on, and that we need to design our economy differently. And they all have slightly different emphasis, but at their core, they all come up with very, very similar objectives. And so we're using the word well-being economy, and we see that it's quite a broad term, but deliberately so, to be inclusive of all those different conversations that are happening. And a lot of those initiatives are part of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And they all are starting to add up to a bit of momentum, that there is a different way of doing things. There has to be a different way of doing things, because even if we can't sketch it out perfectly to the nth degree, that isn't a reason for sticking with what we've got. Because we know, we just cannot carry on the way things are. I was talking earlier about being called a fluffy bunny. I think the ultimate fluffy bunny is someone who thinks we'll just carry on business as usual in the face of all the science and the face of all the evidence. So all this growing movement, this growing momentum, and I think people will naturally gravitate to different areas. So the circular economy is about how we produce things and design our manufacturing system. The regenerative economy is particularly about how we ensure that nature is not just protected, but it's even better, regenerative. The solidarity economy is about ensuring that how we connect with each other and have businesses designed in a way that wealth is shared much more equally. But they're all part of the jigsaw. They're all part of the visioning a different way of doing the system.
One here, 3 rows back.
Thank you. And as an aside, the Old English word for well-being includes, the root is holiness, which is rather nice. I think what you're saying is important, but it's been said for a very long time. It's not new, although the momentum may be, but it is picking at the edge of some very, very resistant core of power, which we meet through our international media and through a growth of a degree of right-wing politics, which I propose would be very hostile to the economic model that you're proposing.
So is the question, how do we stay hopeful? How do we keep going?
More than that, how do we actually act? Because this group's not typical, and I expect many of us have been picking away in our different ways for 50, 60 years even.
Yeah.
It's not just optimism, it is what we do when now things are at a tipping point, to use what we've grown with and keep the momentum and the wisdom of youth, which we underestimate.
So
how do we pick at it? We've got a very powerful media against us, a very, very resistant economic model, of which this is great, but it's at the edges as yet, even the big shipping companies.
And the good news is that new things always emerge from the edges, not from the centre out. There's a cartoon that a friend of mine who was working on the equal marriage campaign in Australia sent me, and it's a series of stairs, and at the top are people with the banner of disability rights and rights for children and saving the whales. And it's folks down the bottom of their banner with equal marriage. And they go through the, first they laugh at you, and they ridicule you, and then they try to attack you, and then they start to accept you, and then they take you seriously, and then you get there. And it's a cartoon version of essentially this idea of moving the Overton window. Are folks familiar with that concept? That idea that we need to shift into this realm of sort of broad public acceptability before we have a chance that our political leaders will take it seriously. This audience, you probably all remember Yes Minister. And you remember when Sir Humphrey wanted to quash something, he'd say, "That's very brave, Minister." And so it's hard to find a brave minister. So we need to be pushing them to make them feel that, our political leaders feel that this is obvious and they better hurry up and do it if they're going to be on the right side of public momentum. And so it comes back to a space about shifting the conversations. And a good example is that when I first started working in the Beyond GDP conversation about 10 years ago, every meeting I would go to with a civil servant or often another NGO, I would probably have to spend half of that outlining how flawed and inappropriate gross domestic product was as a measure of progress for a country. I don't need to do that anymore, not because of me, but because of the conversations and the momentum around that. Now, of course, feminist economists and ecological economists have been pointing out the flaws of GDP for decades. It was back in 1968 when Robert Kennedy did his most beautiful poetic tirade against GDP. And if you haven't watched it on YouTube, watch it because it's beautiful. So these things take time, but I think there is a bit of a confluence of things emerging now. And I think partly we're seeing coming together young people coming out of their classrooms, but also marry that with the reams and reams of scientific evidence making the case of why we need to change how we do our economies. And I think momentum is moving. I won't kid you that it's hard not to get overwhelmed in the face of massive media pressure, and I can't not pretend I don't despair in the reaction to the Australian fires when we had the Murdoch press essentially downplaying their unprecedented nature, saying, of course, Australia will recover. We've had fires like these before. We haven't. They were extraordinary. Ferocity and the extent of landmass and the numbers of animals that were destroyed. And yet you have the Murdoch front pages in Australia not even featuring the fires. The other good news, though, is that so many people who were fighting those fires were doing so voluntarily, doing so out of kindness and compassion and caring for each other, protecting other people's houses while their own houses were burning down. And it's that sort of initiative that I guess causes me to have hope, but it's hard not to. There's a wonderful quote from Schumacher, and he wrote this in the 70s, and he said, how is it that we can have hope to turn things around, make the massive shift that we need to? And he said, do we have any hope of this? Can we be optimistic it will happen in time? And he was writing in the 70s. And he says, to answer yes to that is to lead to complacency. To answer no to that is to lead to despair. So he says, the thing is to put such complexities and perplexities behind us and roll up our sleeves and get on with it. And so that's my answer, and it's a bit sort of Buckminster Fullerish, but it is start to just build what you can now in your spheres of influence, because the only way we'll demonstrate that something different is desirable and feasible is by being able to point to it in real life. So, yeah, I think it is get on with it.
Is there a question on this side of the House? Yes, in the front.
I'm a bit hesitant to ask this question because I've got no economic background at all. I mean, two of my children did well at A-level in economics, but it's not something for me. My background's applied science and theology. But thinking about practical ways forward, one of the things which I've sort of come across was the suggestion that we might sort of, in a sense, bypass the politics, but go to the business and industry. And particularly in relation to our houses, our dwellings, which, I mean, is a big impact on CO2 emissions and carbon footprint compared with cars and so on. And how to, with existing housing stock, never mind looking to the future and improvements, but how we could indeed stimulate and to scale up what could be done to insulate and provide alternative heating sources, and whether the faith communities in this country, including Scotland, might be able to work together to say that for what we have some control over, our places of worship and places with community centres, buildings that we have, what we could do to say we want them to be as close to zero carbon in terms of their footprint, and therefore to see what we could stimulate in terms of heat pumps, developing insulations with aerogel or whatever it may be. Now, whether that would be economically sensible, I have no idea. Any thoughts on this sort of approach?
I think that's to you.
I'm not an expert on houses either. But yes, I mean, that links in with the question I was going to raise with Katherine about actually the sort of incentives we give through tax and so on, where actually you can incentivize carbon-friendly housing by the way you tax or don't tax items. And that seems to be an entirely deliverable aspect of the tax system if you wanted to make that a priority. And that leads to the wider question I was going to ask Katherine. I mean, we have a tax justice stall over there. Your book talks a bit about tax, and we haven't really this morning. But in the particular context of climate change, I mean, what for you would be the big tax questions that you'd like addressed? Housing being one interesting subset.
Absolutely. So tax to me is a huge lever of change. And if you think of it at its most basic, there's three roles of tax. One is to provide or pay for public services and, you know, the things that we collectively say are important to invest in and to provide for. Another one is a bit of redistribution, but I would say that that's a sign of failure, just being content just to redistribute. We need to actually stop and ask why have the gaps between rich and poor opened up so wide in the first place. And then the other role for tax that I don't think we lean on heavily enough is to encourage or disincentivize the sort of activities we want. And there are obvious ways and examples where this is already happening. So Sweden, for example, has taken off VAT on products that can be repaired. So, I mean, most of our phones, does anyone still have a DVD player? I still do. But if it breaks, it's cheaper currently under current pricing rules and current tax and the way we price repair, the cost of the labour to repair, to throw it away and buy another one. But that's perverse. I mean, that's insane. With all that we know about how precious the minerals are that are in that DVD player, the importance of actually the labour providing repair. I mean, repairing something is actually a great source of fulfilment and decent work if we do it right. And so using the tax system to rebalance the sort of economic activity we want is really, really vital. It's also vital in terms of taxing that unearned wealth that we were talking about earlier. At the moment, capital gains tax is taxed more lightly than labour, and yet we know work is so often, if it's good quality, is so important in people's sense of identity and fulfilment and connection. So imagine if we shifted tax away from labour so that, for example, if John owned a store and you employed four people, you'd be taxed per head. What if we shifted it so you were taxed per hour? And then you'd be incentivized to employ more people, but perhaps for less hours. So we start to turn the table on those extremes of working hours and actually encourage the shared work that we need. So the tax system is I'd say, huge untapped lever of change. Also incentivizing those sorts of business activities I was talking about earlier, because they are flourishing. There's a Harvard economist, Herard Sabiti, who's described this new growing ecosystem of pro-social businesses as the emerging fourth sector. But if we could tax those more lightly, so tax cooperatives more lightly, tax social enterprises more likely, tax community interest companies more likely, then we're going to see people start to gravitate towards those ways of doing business, and then we can start to change the makeup of our economic system, and then we can start to move towards the change we need to see. But yeah, I'm very excited about the potential of tax. I think your point, Peter, isn't it? is really well made about the role of churches looking at your own stock. I mean, I suspect many church buildings are pretty inefficient in terms of energy use, pretty drafty, pretty hard to heat. So if we can crack that, then there's a hell of a good example to probably all the other property across the UK. But what came to mind, the image that came to mind as you were talking, is the construction of an Amish church. You know, a whole community flourishing around to build something. Imagine if we could have these sorts of, community there piling in and doing the retrofitting that we need so that churches are the most energy efficient buildings. And maybe that's learning to double glaze stained glass. I don't even know if that's possible, but maybe that's what we need to discover. Can we double glaze stained glass? Or triple glaze it, even better?
Yes, you can double glaze stained glass, I can confirm that.
Superb. I told you it was a question for you.
There's one question submitted which I think identifies what for me is a very large issue, but not one we've actually touched on, which I don't actually think the book touches on very much either. You've identified that GDP isn't a very satisfactory measure, but this question highlights a different issue with the way we currently look at the economy. How do you switch focus from the short term, more money today, to long-term sustainability for tomorrow in economics? Short term is always easier to sell, question mark.
Yes, and really good question. So Unilever have tried to do this. They've tried to discourage people from sort of churning their ownership of Unilever shares because they're really going for long-term investors. And their share price went down initially, and the then CEO, who's now left, Paul Polman, said, okay, we need to be cool with that because we want the sort of investors that are with us for the long term. And I think there are businesses that are starting to get their head around that. So I spent a lot of time working for and with massive mining company who they don't move, they don't think in quarters by very nature of their business. They think probably in 20, 30-year cycles. And so for them, what was on the table was their community relationships, yes, their environmental performance, and so they had the engineering prowess to invest in the cutting-edge technology to make sure that their mines are at the best quality and environmental standard. Whether we need mining we do at the moment, right, is another question. But they were also a big company. They were also super vulnerable to their reputation. And there was a real paradox for me there. This was a massive corporate, but because they needed to be able to get the license to operate in other locations, and if people were protesting at their shareholder meetings, then very quickly they were one of the first divestment cases back in 1995. People were taking their money out of a uranium investment this company had. So I think there are examples of companies that are starting to have that. Google has a two-tiered share system. In order for I'm not a fan of Google, but it's an example of different classifications of shares, and maybe you have perhaps more voting rights for those who hold on to their shares longer, because one of the biggest challenges is this churn in the share market. And if you're not holding something for a long time, you don't really care about it. And it's the same with our things, yeah? We've now got, I heard someone on the bus once, this girl on the bus was telling her friend that she'd bought 3 dresses from Primark, didn't know if they even fitted, didn't know if she even liked them, but it didn't matter because she'd just throw them away if she didn't like them because they were so cheap. And partly why she's able to think like that is because those dresses are artificially cheap, because they don't take into account the social, let alone the environmental impact. So changing those costs, so we've got full cost accounting. And then, of course, because you're all social justice orientated, you'll be thinking, well, what about consumers who don't have loads of money? Won't that put them at a disadvantage? And I'd agree with you. But that shows that we have a bigger job ahead of us. We need to attend to folks on low income rather than saying, well, that's not a reason to increase prices so they're more accurate in terms of their social and environmental impact. It's a long, unwieldy answer to your question, but I so agree the tyranny of short-termism is a huge problem.
It's underlining the general point that we've touched on several times, that if you can incentivize people, whether it's by legal means or tax means, to do what is actually beneficial to the community, that's a powerful force alongside trying to persuade people in their heads rationally and logically to do what's right.
It's also not just incentivizing, but also enabling them, because I think often those sorts of activities are more aligned with what we want to be doing anyway. I think there is that deep sense of compassion, cooperation that we have as human beings, and yet we've got an economic system that's trying to knock the hell out of us and quash it and sort of put all the barriers to it. And I think that's also partly enabling that side of us to flourish. And I mean, if you only think about it, so many of our high streets are set up the same way you go into an airport, and it's like going through a duty-free store. You can't get to a cafe without walking past 5 different shops. And you have to buy things. The way we design our cities are becoming so orientated around consumption rather than choirs or communities coming together. And so I think it's also about enabling that side of human nature to come to the fore rather than to be downplayed the way it currently is.
And many people here will be aware that both the Methodist Church and the United Reformed Church were involved in the pioneering stages of conversations between the churches and the mining companies about their ethics. And one of the mining stories in your book resonates entirely with my experience, which was a case in Australia where it was crucial that a key person in the company had this wider vision and wasn't willing to be constrained by short-termism and profit motives and so on. And I think as Christians, one of the things we actually can valuably hold on to is the significance of the individual. We're not just about structures, the gospel is also about changing hearts.
Yep.
And when there are people inside the system who actually have their heart in the right place, they can still make an enormous difference to the way the culture, the thinking, excuse me, and the mindset of even a huge institution can be shaped. So praying for supporting those who are in positions of influence, as well as feeling that maybe most of us are outsiders looking on at this monolith, is, I think, the other side of what the gospel would encourage us to do.
Can I say a word on that? Because I think it is a good example of how massive things can change. So it was Rio Tinto. And in the early 90s, there was a ruling in the High Court of Australia that centuries overdue recognised legally that Aboriginal people had been living in Australia before the Brits colonised it. So it was a huge shift in what's called native title, who have title, access to land, and essentially saying the High Courts recognised First Nations ownership of land. As you can imagine, the mining community went nuts because a lot of their interests, where the minerals were located, were in these remote parts of Australia where Aboriginal communities could prove continuous connection to land. And so they lobbied like crazy to try and pull back the legal implications of that it's called the Mabo ruling. And then Rio Tinto, because of the guy who at the time was CEO, who had grown up in outback Australia, a guy called Leon Davies, he'd had a scholarship from the mining company, so he recognised since his early 20s when mining companies are providing, when there's the largesse, how good that can be. He was also working in Bougainville in the 80s, where local communities were so angry at the mining company, they were blowing up their pipelines. So he saw what happened viscerally when communities are angry at the company. And he said, okay, we will work with native title. We will create really generous agreements with those Aboriginal communities. The rest of the mining companies went ferocious at him. They went crazy at him because there was this massive company, a big player on the Australian stock market, saying we can handle this. And that individual, Leon Davies, I mean, what he did is he combined what he knew was right in his heart, because he'd had this journey of seeing the importance of getting it right and working with communities, but he could also mobilise the business case. And I think if you've got connections with people like him in big institutions, support them. And if they're feeling lonely or frustrated, help them survive in that system, because we need them in there, whether they're working for big investment houses or massive companies. We need people in the inside who can marry their personal concern with changing the sort of economic rationale for doing things.
Okay, another question from the floor. Yes, second row here.
Hi, I'm sorry, I'm French. I'm going to have an awful accent. So when you were talking about the Google company, and about the ideas that people now have for, like, in 30 years, what's going to happen? How do you manage this generational flip that you will have in 20 years? Because today, I'm 22, I'm going to go to work in maybe, let's say, 5 years if I'm finishing a high degree. Then I'm going to get involved, have my ideas to to resolve or try to impact today's climate change or just the political issues that we can have. But in 10 years, it's going to be my youngest brother who will have completely different concerns. He's 10 years younger than me, which means that we will keep having new ideas, but I will still be working in 35 years, 50 years, and have maybe still the same ideas and try to achieve my ideas, but we will have the youngest generations with their new ideas. How can we keep this flow of, I would say, involvement into all those spheres? Because it's not about talking in 10 years, it's about talking in 50 years now, which is way harder for us, and we have to consider that the politics are getting older too, with all the ways to think about it. So how can we manage to keep things going?
How can we keep these conversations alive? And I think you spoke about your younger brother who's currently at school or university? Okay. So, one of the challenges is that so much of the school curriculum is not aligned with these new realities. And we heard it from the kids. I think one of their what ifs was what if school taught about climate science. So Italy has just brought in, it's extraordinary, isn't it, that the first country in the world to teach sustainable development as a core part of the curriculum rather than just 1 hour, as one semester. It's baffling. I was surprised, but apparently Italy is the first one to bring that in, which is astounding. But that speaks to this idea that what we teach and the knowledge we create cannot anymore be this sort of broken recipe that we used to think served us well. And one of the things I'm most encouraged by is the number of students who are, particularly economics students, who are coming out of their classrooms and saying to their lecturers, stop teaching us this 1980s economics that treats the environment as an externality just to be sort of pumped effluent into and, as an input to production. And they're starting to really irritate that economics curriculum. And there's now more and more textbooks being rolled out. There's more and more lectures being done, and I think that's starting to shift. But I'm hopeful that the idea of these new flourishing of ideas I think is exactly what we need, because it won't. If it was easy, it would just be one silver bullet. People often say, "Oh, Katherine, what's the one thing you would do?" And I hate that question because it's not that easy. It's not just a sort of 30-piece jigsaw. It's about a 3,000-piece jigsaw of the sorts of changes we need to see. So if you and your younger brother and all your peers at university are coming up with new ideas, absolutely fantastic. I guess the worry I have is the risk of despair that might quash any sense of agency or any sense of optimism that it's worth trying to put them into practice. One of our colleagues from We All Youth says that the biggest challenges facing young people today is despair. And so I think it's up to everyone to help nurture those sorts of ideas and help sort of have your back to support and implement those ideas as well, and take those ideas seriously. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I think if I'd been writing your book for this audience, I would have added a chapter about giving in it. The good Wesleyans present will know that John Wesley early in his life decided he'd work out how much he needed to live on. I think it was £32 at the time. And for the rest of his life, he'd live on £32 a year. Wow. And if he got other sources of income, which indeed he did when he started writing widely read books and so on, he'd actually make sure that none of that was spent on himself. Wow. And some of us here will remember how when we were trying to campaign with the government to set targets for overseas aid, which in the recent elections all the main parties are now adopted, although at the time it was regarded as eccentric and a bit off the scale, we said, well, actually, we'll make sure we give at least 1% of our own income to almost give us the moral authority to do the campaigning. And I think giving, actually choosing ourselves that we will use the resources we've got, the things that we have direct influence on in a different way from the other people up and down the street, is perhaps a beginning of claiming some moral authority. Are there other things you see that churches distinctively might do, as opposed to all the other people of goodwill who support the general direction of your work? Are there distinctive things you'd like the churches to be prominent in?
So I think the churches do have an extraordinary moral mandate, because so often churches are there supporting the most marginalised when no one else is. On so many social causes, when everyone else has walked away, the church is there, which means you've got the best witness to how bad things are, and that any claims of progress are flawed until we reach out to those who are so far behind. So I think utilising that to just not let anyone say, you know, we're a developed country or a country that's made it, I think is really powerful. But also to turn and to mobilise the conversation around, it is the economy stupid. I mean, the economy's not everything, but it's a huge part of the challenge, and to push those discussions. So Ellery, I think, is doing a session later this afternoon talking about the economics crash course that she and the Church of Scotland have been delivering, and I think those sorts of initiatives are really, really great to enable people to talk about economics with feeling a bit confident and say, you know, it's not this crazy, messy area that's on the back pages of the Financial Times with rows and rows of share prices, but it's actually how we choose to look after each other and how we choose to care for our planet. And so putting the shoulder of the church and the access to the corridors of power that you will get that few other institutions will get, and really using those to say, no, this is serious, we really do need to transform the economy. It's not fluffy bunny territory, it's absolutely urgent, I think is vital, and I think more so. And so the invitation would be to become part of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance so that we can do all we can to support your work. We're really keen to set up a faith cluster, and so perhaps there's a conversation we can have there if folks want to talk to me about that.
Great, well, thank you very much. That has used our time, but I'm very grateful, as I'm sure you are, to Katherine for coming today, for being willing to answer questions on the hoof, and to give us so many insights. And if you do buy her book, I think you'll find a lot of hope there. If you're tending to despair or thinking we've been at this for 50 years, no one's listening, the book gives you lots of examples, as you've said this morning in a briefer way, of what's actually happening around the places. The more they can be joined up, the more people are inspired by those to believe it's possible. The book doesn't perhaps entirely say how do we get over all the people who aren't with us yet on this, but in terms of persuading us that things are possible if the will is there, the book's a very powerful and very accessible document, whether or not your background's in economics. So thank you again very much, Katherine. Please.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching this recording from the JPIT National Conference 2020. For more great resources, visit our website, jointpublicissues.org.uk.